Some people believe death ends a story, but sometimes that's when it begins. The morning she called, I was alone in the kitchen, the same one my father rebuilt by hand over 2 long summers. Light spilled in through the stained glass windows he'd chosen for their warmth. Casting soft ribbons across the wood floors he refused to replace no matter how many times she insisted. Everything in this house bore his fingerprints. And then the phone buzzed. One name flashed across the screen: Rebecca. I didn't answer right away. With her, timing mattered. Every word she spoke was a performance, and I had learned never to interrupt the act. I sipped my coffee, let the silence stretch, then picked up my voice calm measured. She didn't say hello. I've sold the house, she announced, her tone laced with satisfaction. The buyers move in next week. Just like that. As if it were hers to sell. As if my father's life could be swept away with a signature. I didn't ask questions. I knew better. She thrived on reaction, but even still, the way she said it, that smug certainty, it clawed something loose in me. Something ancient. Something furious. Which house? I asked, softly watching dust float through the golden light. She laughed. Don't play dumb, Alice. The house, your father's house. The one you've been staying in since he passed rent-free, as if it still belonged to you. I said nothing, not yet. The thing is, Rebecca always underestimated silence. She mistook it for surrender. My father didn't. He taught me the difference. He taught me that silence is where plans are born, where truth gathers weight. I thought back to the last time I saw him alive. The way he leaned in close, his voice hoarse from the illness eating him away. There will come a moment, he whispered. She will try. Let her. At the time, I didn't know what he meant. I do now. Rebecca's voice sliced back through the lines, sharper now. I've signed the contracts. They've paid the deposit. You have until next Friday to pack your things and get out. Understood. I smiled. She couldn't see it, but I smiled. Because while she was busy playing games with realtors and pretending this house was hers, she never once thought to check the name on the deed. She didn't know about the meeting my father arranged, the documents he signed, the legal knots he tied years before his death, before he ever married her. She had sold a house that legally never belonged to her, and now she was about to find out. She hung up without saying goodbye. That was Rebecca's way: drop a grenade, then walk away before the dust settles. But I didn't feel anger, not really. What I felt was colder, sharper, like standing on a frozen lake and hearing the first cracks beneath the surface. I placed my phone on the counter with deliberate calm, then looked around the kitchen, the same space where Dad taught me to make pancakes when I was 7. The same room where we celebrated his last birthday, the cake slumped in the middle, candles flickering against his weak smile. Everything in this house was memory, texture, proof. And now she was trying to gut it, sell it, bury it. But Dad had known what she was. I walked to the front window and pulled aside the curtain, letting the light pour in. Across the yard, the rose garden stretched wide, 20 feet of wild, beautiful defiance. His pride and joy. Every plant handpicked. Every bloom a reminder of who he was before her. I reached for my phone again, not to call Rebecca, but someone else entirely. Someone who mattered. James Harrison answered on the second ring. Is it time? He asked. She pulled the trigger. I replied. There was a pause, then a breath of amusement on the other end. Just like your father predicted. Shall we begin? I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. Make sure the buyers are informed. I don't want them tangled in this. I'll have a letter delivered within the hour. I hung up and let the silence settle again. The house creaked softly in response, not old but alive. Like it was listening. Rebecca had always tried to rewrite the script. When she first arrived, she wore sweetness like perfume. Overly sweet, artificial. She smiled too much, complimented the wallpaper, cooked extravagant meals. But her eyes were always calculating. Even on the day they married, I saw it. That flicker of cold beneath her mascara. It was 6 months before she started rearranging things. First, small moving dad's books from the shelves, putting family photos in boxes labeled miscellaneous. Then, bigger, suggesting that the old banisters were dated, that the fireplace wasn't functional, that the rose garden wasted too much water. But she never touched anything while he was in the room. Only when he was too tired, too sick to fight back. She fed him teas with names I couldn't pronounce and pressed essential oils to his wrists while whispering about letting go of the past. I knew better. He did too. One night, not long before the end, he called me into the study. The fire was low, his skin looked pale, but his eyes, they were focused. "I'm running out of time," he said, "and she thinks I don't know what she's doing. But I've been watching." I said nothing. I just sat there listening. "She's after the house, after the history. But she doesn't understand legacy, Alice. She doesn't know how deep roots grow." He reached for an envelope in his desk and slid it across to me. "When I'm gone, take this to Harrison. Don't open it. Just trust me." That was Dad. Never dramatic, never vengeful, just exact. The kind of man who anticipated storms and built the roof stronger before the first drop fell. And now, 2 years later, that roof was still holding. Rebecca had walked into the perfect storm, a legal maze built quietly over a decade. Through Harrison's help, Dad had transferred the house into a protected trust out of reach even by marriage. A shield wrapped in signatures. It wasn't revenge, it was insurance. I moved from room to room that afternoon, running my fingers along the grooves of the walls, the banisters, the window frames he sanded down himself. I opened a closet and found his old flannel jacket still smelling faintly of cedar and soap. In the corner of the study, a faded photograph of the two of us sat me at 16, paintbrush in hand, mid-laugh, him beside me, covered in specks of sky blue. That room would never belong to Rebecca, no matter what paperwork she signed. That evening, I sat in the garden pruning the roses just as he used to. The thorns nipped at my gloves. The soil was cool and quiet beneath my knees. I was still there kneeling beside the lavender bush when I heard the crunch of tires in the driveway. A silver Mercedes. My chest tightened, not with fear, but anticipation. She stepped out wearing heels, designer sunglasses, and a face painted with fury. In her hand, a letter already crumpled. I stayed kneeling. Let her walk the stone path in her ridiculous stilettos, let the wind play with the ends of her expensive scarf. I didn't rise. I didn't speak. I just waited. "You lied to me," she hissed, holding the letter out like a weapon. "You knew this the whole time." I stood slowly, brushing soil from my jeans, taking my time. "I followed Dad's instructions," I said, voice level. "You're the one who assumed." Her jaw clenched. "He never would have done this to me." I tilted my head. "Are you sure?" She faltered just for a second, but it was enough. "I was his wife," she snapped, stepping forward. "This house was ours." "No," I replied. "It was never yours. He moved it to a trust long before he met you. You were just passing through." Her hands trembled. The letter shook. "The buyers are furious," she said, voice rising. "They're threatening legal action. Do you know how humiliating this is?" "Almost as humiliating as trying to sell a house you don't own," I said softly. Her nostrils flared. Her eyes darted toward the house as if some secret might still save her. "You don't know what it was like," she said suddenly. "Living with him, watching him fade. I took care of him." I raised an eyebrow. "Is that what you call what was in his tea?" Her lips parted, then closed again. A flicker of fear passed through her. "I know everything," I continued, voice low. "The prenup you refused to sign, the withdrawals you made behind his back, the men, the powder. It's all there." She took a step back. "You have no proof." I pulled my phone from my pocket, showed her the screen. "You sure about that?" Her face crumpled, the mask slipping. The fury drained out of her like air from a balloon. "You're bluffing," she whispered. I shrugged. "Try me." She looked down, then away, then back toward the car. "This isn't over," she said, voice brittle. "It is," I replied. She turned her heels, wobbling on the stones. Halfway to the car, the letter slipped from her grip and fluttered to the ground like a surrender flag. I waited until her taillights disappeared. Then I picked it up, smoothing the creases. The words were legal, cold, precise, like Dad's signature on every page of that trust. She had no claim, no legal ground, no chance. That night, I lit a fire in the study, sat beneath the shelves he built, surrounded by the scent of leather and ash. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt intact, like something that had been on the verge of shattering had held just barely through the storm. I pulled out the letter he left me the day before he died, the one I hadn't opened until now. I ran my fingers across the ink, his careful script. My dearest Alice, if you're reading this, it means she's made her move. I'm sorry I couldn't tell you everything, but some truths require timing. She was watching, always watching. You were the one thing she couldn't erase. So I gave you the house and the proof. Check behind the third brick in the fireplace, you'll understand. I rose slowly and crossed to the hearth. My hands searched the stone. The third brick gave way with a soft scrape. Behind it, tucked in a velvet pouch, was a small USB drive, and with it, a single scrap of paper. For when silence is no longer enough. The pouch was soft in my hands, the velvet worn down to a matte finish from age or maybe planning. I sat back on the floor of the study, the same spot where I'd listened to his records sprawled out as a child while he annotated his books or rewired an old lamp because no machine should die before its time. I turned the USB over in my fingers, small, ordinary, just plastic and metal. But the weight of it was disproportionate, as though it carried not just files, but intention. I didn't open it right away. Instead, I placed it on the desk beside his favorite fountain pen and watched the flames shift behind the fireplace grate. I could hear his voice in my mind, calm and deliberate. Timing is everything, Alice. Let her move first. Then and only then reveal the board. She had moved, and it was time. I slid the drive into my laptop. At first, it was just folders, all dated. Organized, of course. Dad had always kept his world in order, even as it unraveled around him. I opened the first one, Kitchen, November 12th. It was video. Grainy but clear. The view was from above, discreet. Probably a camera tucked into the light fixture or inside the old smoke detector. The angle showed Rebecca dressed in one of her soft pastel robes standing at the kitchen counter. Her movements were casual, fluid, a woman confident in her domain, until she reached into her purse and pulled out a small glass vial. I didn't breathe. She looked both ways as if someone might enter, then opened the vial, tapped a tiny portion of its contents into his tea. Stirred, smiled. The video had no sound, but I could hear her laugh in my mind. That tight, triumphant sound I'd come to associate with her victories. Another folder, a second video, studied December 3rd. This time she was on the phone, pacing, leaning against the bookshelf like it belonged to her. Once he's gone, it's mine. All of it. The house, the land. Do you know how much this place is worth? Her voice clear, cold, confident. I kept clicking through the files. Everyone a nail in the coffin of the story she'd told the world. She hadn't cared for him. She'd orchestrated him, played the part of the devoted wife while plotting her exit complete with profit margins. In one clip, she was in his study alone, flipping through his financial documents. In another, she was at the front door with a stranger, a man I didn't recognize, showing him around, gesturing to the walls, pointing out potential for renovations. She was already planning the erasure of everything he'd built while his body was still warm. I closed the laptop and sat in silence. It wasn't shock. Not really. I'd always known there was something rotten at the center of her, but proof was different. Proof made the ground solid beneath your feet. It gave shape to the ghost you'd suspected but couldn't name. I called Harrison. He picked up immediately. Alice. I have it, I said. His voice dropped into that quiet tone lawyers use when they know the next move will end the game. What's on it? Everything, I replied. enough to take her down publicly, legally, completely. He was silent for a beat. And what do you want to do with it? I stared at the fireplace, the heat brushing my legs, the scent of oak smoke and old books wrapping around me like a memory. Nothing, I said. There was a pause. Are you sure? I don't want to destroy her. I just want her gone. I want my father's house to breathe again. Without her shadow in the corners, James exhaled. That's what your father would have wanted. He said as much when we put all of this in motion. I leaned back into the armchair, Dad's armchair, the leather soft from decades of use. He knew what she was, didn't he? Yes, Harrison said. He did. But he needed her to think she was winning. If she sensed the trap, she'd vanish and maybe take something far worse with her. He wanted her close until the end. I thought about that, about the years he endured knowing, watching, pretending. Then let's not go nuclear, I said. Let's let her stew in the knowledge that I could, that I didn't. There was a quiet chuckle on the other end. Your father said you'd make the right call. I hung up. For the next few days, the house felt different. Not just safe, but alive. I walked from room to room, fixing the small things she'd tampered with. The pillows she replaced with the sterile grays, I returned to their original patterns. The books she'd stuffed into boxes, labeled, dated, I reshelved everyone. I repainted the dining room, the exact shade of soft blue he loved, the one we'd argued about for 3 weeks until he finally said, You're right, kiddo. It looks like peace. Peace, that was what I was rebuilding now. But peace didn't mean passivity. 3 days after our confrontation, an envelope arrived. No return address. But I knew her handwriting. Inside a notarized letter formally relinquishing all claims to the property and estate. Tucked in with it, a shorter note. You win. I'm leaving the state. Keep what you know to yourself. I stared at the signature. No flourish, no insult, just resignation. I folded the papers and placed them in Dad's desk drawer behind the stack of letters he'd written to Mom before she passed. As I closed the drawer, a quiet settled in my chest. Not the stillness of grief, the stillness of balance. In the weeks that followed, the garden bloomed more wildly than it had in years. The roses stretched like they knew the air was safe again. I knelt among them every morning, pruning, watering, whispering thoughts I never said aloud. Sometimes I swore I could hear him answer, not in words, in warmth, in the way the wind moved through the branches, in the way the light hit the stained glass just right, at 7:42 a.m., the time he used to start his day. I never did use the USB, but I didn't destroy it either. It remains behind the brick, a sentinel in shadow, a quiet reminder of what we survived, of the patience it took to win without war, of the kind of strength my father spent his life teaching me. Rebecca vanished. I never heard from her again. The buyers backed out, of course, once Harrison sent them the real deed. The trust held, the law stood, and I remained. But the greatest victory wasn't legal, it was spiritual. It was walking through the house at dusk barefoot on the old floors, hearing the creak of the stairs and knowing it wasn't a ghost, it was history. It was opening a drawer and finding one of his handwritten grocery lists, chuckling at how he always forgot the eggs. It was pouring coffee in the mug he once dropped and glued back together, a crack still visible down the side. It was knowing that even in death, he protected me not with vengeance, but with vision. This house, with its imperfect walls and slanted garden path, was a cathedral of memory. Every surface whispered his name. Every window caught his reflection when I passed too quickly. He was here. Still. Always. Not because he haunted it, because he built it with love and protected it with strategy. She tried to erase that, but his final move made sure she couldn't. And me, I didn't win by fighting. I won by remembering who I was raised to be. The thing no one tells you about winning quietly is that it doesn't feel like victory. There are no applause tracks, no medals, no final blows landed in front of gasping witnesses. You just breathe. You walk through a house that's finally yours untouched, not just in law, but in meaning. And you begin to realize this wasn't about property. This was about belonging. That winter, I didn't leave the house for long stretches of time. Not because I was hiding the war was over, but because I was relearning the shape of the silence. Silence without tension. Silence that didn't have her voice tucked inside it. I took to walking the perimeter of the land every morning, the soles of my boots pressing into the frosted soil where Dad's roses curled into themselves for warmth. I'd run my fingers along the edge of the wooden gate, still not quite level after his last repair. He'd been too sick to fix it properly. He just shrugged and said, even doors should lean sometimes. That line stayed with me. I spent hours in his study, not searching for more secrets. I'd had enough of those, but just to sit. I'd light the fire, let the record player hum, and read one of the old books he left behind, full of annotations and side notes. His handwriting was its own kind of soundtrack. Little thoughts crammed in margins like conversations between timelines, notes for himself. Sometimes I'd find a question scribbled in the corner of a page and answer it out loud, as if he'd just stepped out for a moment and left the discussion unfinished. But the truth was he was gone, and what remained was legacy. Not the house, not the will, not the USB. It was how he moved through the world and how he taught me to do the same. Rebecca never came back. Whether shame or calculation kept her away, I didn't care. The finality of her exit came not with a fight, but with an absence. It was as if the moment she realized she couldn't take the house, she also realized she had no place left to haunt. The real punishment was not legal. It was that she'd built her identity around something that was never hers to claim. And now without it, she vanished into her own emptiness. In February, the sky changed. The dull grays stretched longer, then broke apart in sudden bursts of blue. The sun came back slowly, like someone peeking through the curtain after a long illness. I started opening the windows again, not just to air the place out, but to let it breathe, to let me breathe. Me. I repainted the upstairs hallway. It wasn't in bad shape, but there were scuff marks, chips along the baseboards, little signs of neglect. I chose a pale yellow this time. Not Dad's blue. Something new. Not to overwrite him, but to begin something of my own. Because this house wasn't just his anymore, it was ours, mine, and his in memory and in motion. On a Wednesday afternoon while clearing out the attic, I found a wooden box I hadn't seen before. No locks, just a slide top lid with my initials carved into it. The box held photographs, dozens. Some I remembered birthdays, vacations, Sunday mornings in the garden, but others I didn't. Pictures of me sleeping in the back seat of the car, of me with paint on my nose, of me holding a letter I wrote him as a child, grinning like I'd just saved the world. He'd kept everything, quietly, as if memory itself was sacred. And there beneath the stack, a note. I didn't always say the right things, but I watched, I remembered. I believed in who you'd become. I sat cross-legged in the dust holding that note and cried for the first time since he passed. Not from grief, but from recognition. From the strange, aching joy of being truly seen. People think legacy is about money, about land or names on deeds or portraits over the mantle. But this was the real thing. The photos, the notes, the trust in me. He hadn't left me a house. He left me evidence of love. In March, Harrison called. Just checking in, he said. You've been quiet. I've been okay, I answered, sorting through things, letting the silence settle. He was quiet for a moment, then said, you know, your father used to say something strange about you. Oh. He said, Alice was never loud, but she's the storm when it's time. I smiled. He always did like metaphors. And he was right, Harrison said. You could have gone scorched earth. Instead, you let her destroy herself. That's not just strategy. That's grace. I didn't want a win like her, I said. Which is why you did. After we hung up, I wandered outside into the garden. The roses were waking. Tiny green buds pushing forward, unaware of the drama that had nearly replaced them with patio tiles and faux grass. Life doesn't care for our power struggles. It just keeps growing. That night, I sat down at Dad's desk and started writing. Not legal documents, not revenge letters, but a story this story. I didn't know why at first. Maybe it was for myself. Maybe for the version of me who nearly believed I was powerless. Maybe one day for a daughter of my own if life allowed it. But more than anything, I wrote because this house needed to speak, and I was finally ready to let it. The ink flowed like breath. I told it all not as a list of events, but as a transformation. From grief to grounding, from silence to stillness, from being overlooked to becoming the one who sees clearly. I ended the letter with 3 words. We're still here. Because we were, and Rebecca. She would become a shadow in the margins, a footnote. Not the antagonist of my life, but the proof of how easily people fall when they build their identity on possession instead of presence. Spring arrived slow and soft. Birds returned to the eaves. The windows stayed open longer. And the house, this living, breathing cathedral of love and history, found its rhythm again. So did I. By the time the daffodils appeared at the base of the old willow tree, the house had shifted again. Not physically, but energetically. There's a kind of hum that exists in places touched by love and defended with purpose. You feel it in the stillness between footsteps, in the way the light moves across floorboards that once held arguments and reconciliations. I felt it now as if the very structure had exhaled. One morning, I walked into the kitchen and smelled something I hadn't in a long time: pancakes. Not real ones, just the memory of them. The way the scent of cinnamon clung to the curtains, the trace of syrup that lingered on the counter until noon. I stood there barefoot, smiling at nothing in particular. It wasn't grief anymore. It wasn't sadness. It was presence. He was here, or at least his intention was. That's what legacy becomes when done right. Not an anchor, but a companion. Not a monument to the dead, but a bridge for the living. I didn't try to freeze time. I didn't turn the house into a shrine. I let it breathe. The yellow hallway I'd painted now held framed photos of both of us, me at 10 arms crossed stubbornly, him at 52, elbow deep in rose soil, wearing a floppy gardening hat he swore was ironically stylish. I hung the photo of us covered in paint right outside the study. Not because it was pretty, but because it was true. Downstairs, I replaced the couch Rebecca had insisted on, a sterile gray slab that looked like it belonged in a bank lobby. I found an antique velvet piece, instead soft forest green. It had weight, personality, history. It felt like us. In the evenings, I'd sit on that couch, tea in hand, and watch the wind roll through the stained glass windows. The colors would scatter across the room like whispers. I'd sit there quietly, not waiting for anything, just being. And sometimes I'd laugh, a sudden surprising laugh, because I could finally hear my own thoughts again. For years, I'd lived in that house as though walking a tightrope, careful not to provoke, careful not to contradict, careful not to make too much noise. Rebecca had this way of making even air feel conditional. Now I opened the windows wide, played old records loudly. I even sang off-key Fearless in the hallway while dusting. Liberation isn't always loud. Sometimes it's just you and your father's silence finally aligned. One Saturday, I invited Harrison over for tea. He arrived with a small box of pastries and an old leather briefcase he never traveled without. We sat on the porch where Dad had built the swing himself from salvaged wood. "House looks like it's breathing again," Harrison said. "It's exhaling." He chuckled. "And you?" I nodded. "Getting there." We didn't talk about Rebecca. We didn't need to. Her presence had faded from this place like smoke from a fire long since extinguished. She had no claim here, not legally, not spiritually, not even in memory. What we talked about instead was my father. Harrison told stories I hadn't heard before about how Dad once threatened to fire a contractor for trimming the willow tree too aggressively, how he'd snuck sandwiches into court sessions and passed notes like a schoolboy, how he kept a photo of me in his briefcase for luck. "He loved you," Harrison said quietly. with a kind of bone deep loyalty I rarely see anymore. I looked down at my tea, the steam rising slowly between us. I knew I said, but I didn't know how much until he was gone. Harrison glanced at the house. He's not gone, Alice. He's just quiet now, watching how you carry the torch. That night, I sat in the study and reread the letter he left me. It was worn at the edges now, the paper soft from my hands. I didn't cry. I didn't ache. I just felt rooted, like I belonged, not just here, but in myself. Months passed. The garden grew wild and strange, as if testing how far it could stretch under my care. I let it. Dad had always believed that control was overrated in matters of beauty. The roses bloomed in unlikely places, tangled through the gate, reached toward the sky with unapologetic hunger. Sometimes I'd talk to them, not in the way children talk to imaginary friends, but in the way women talk to their bloodline. One afternoon while pruning, I found a folded sheet of notebook paper inside a hollowed out stone near the garden shed. My father's handwriting again slanted urgent. If you find this, it means the worst is over. Good. I hoped you'd never need it. But if you did, well, now you know the depth of my planning. You always thought I was obsessive. Maybe I was, but only about the things worth saving. You were worth saving. This house was worth protecting. And even when I was tired, even when I wanted to let go, I thought of you and kept going. You were always more patient than you believed. I held the paper against my chest for a long time, the breeze brushing my cheeks like fingertips. He'd hidden strength all over the house, tucked into bricks, buried in books, scribbled in margins. He'd left me breadcrumbs not to follow him, but to remind me who I was when I thought I'd lost the trail. It was poetic, in a way, how Rebecca's final act of sabotage became the trigger for my full awakening. She didn't just try to steal a house, she tried to steal a story, a lineage. But in doing so, she forced me to reclaim it more completely than I ever had before. Sometimes I think she was the final test he left behind. One last storm to sharpen the walls of my resolve. And I passed. By early summer, the house was nearly fully restored. The curtains in the study were new, a soft linen the color of ash. I kept his old desk exactly where it was, even though the chair squeaked obnoxiously when you leaned too far back. I didn't fix it. I liked that it remembered. I started writing more, journals, letters I'd never send, short stories that turned into something longer. I didn't know what it would become, but it felt important, like I was translating something old into something useful. Sometimes I'd sit in the porch swing and watch the sunset cast long shadows over the rose bushes. And in those moments, I'd think about legacy not as something inherited, but something created. Rebecca had always seen legacy as something to take. My father saw it as something to build, and me, I was learning it was something to live. One evening, a letter arrived. No return address again. The handwriting was familiar but different, sloppier, like she'd written it fast, or with a trembling hand. I opened it slowly. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't even expect this to be read. But I need you to know I saw what he gave you. I saw it long before the paperwork. It was in how he looked at you, in how he listened to you. That's why I hated you, because I knew I'd never have that. I tried to take what I thought I was owed, but I was never owed anything. I'm leaving the country, starting over. The house was never mine. But he was once, for a little while. No signature, no apology, just truth. Late, brittle, but real. I didn't write back. I didn't need to. The story was over, and it wasn't hers anymore. It was mine. Quiet, sprawling, unfinished in all the best ways. I folded the letter, placed it in a box marked endings, and tucked it into the back of the linen closet, not to keep as a reminder of her, but as proof that even ghosts know when to bow. That night, I walked the house one last time, not out of routine, but out of reverence. I touched the walls, the banisters, the windows. I thanked them for holding us through it all. I lit a single candle in the fireplace and whispered, "You were right, Dad. Everything bloomed in its own time." And then I slept, dreamless, free. Somewhere in early July, the quiet became a companion. Not the lonely kind, not the silence that presses into your chest and asks if anyone's still listening. This was the stillness of presence, of knowing no one was coming to take anything. No footsteps down the hall that didn't belong. No phone calls that flipped the ground beneath you. For the first time since his death, the house wasn't something I had to protect. It was something I could live in. That realization came to me on an ordinary morning, tea steeping birds fluttering outside the windows. I was standing at the sink watching the garden pulse with the color of summer when I realized I hadn't thought about Rebecca in days. Not in fear, not in anger, not even in triumph. She was simply gone. Her absence no longer defined the space. My presence did. I walked into the garden that afternoon, barefoot on the warm flagstones. The roses, my father's roses, were in their fullest bloom. They spilled over the fences, stretched toward the sun with a kind of unapologetic survival. It struck me then how much they mirrored him, not just in how they stood tall, but in the thorns. In their quiet warning, you can admire me, but you cannot take me. I knelt in the soil and began to dig. Not to uproot anything, but to plant something new. A small sapling, a fig tree, the kind he always said we'd grow one day but never got around to. I found it last week at a local nursery, drawn to its crooked trunk and stubborn leaves. It didn't look impressive, not yet, but I saw what it could become. As I pressed the roots into the earth, I whispered something that surprised me. This is for the child I might have one day. I didn't know where that came from, or if I even wanted children. But suddenly, it didn't feel like the kind of thing to postpone anymore. This house had waited long enough. This life had. Maybe legacy wasn't just about preserving what was. Maybe it was also about making space for what could be. That evening, I walked the halls slowly. The yellow paint in the corridor had warmed under the sun. The velvet couch had softened from use. Even the wood floors seemed richer, as if the house had started exhaling in color. I paused outside the study and looked at the USB drive still resting behind the fireplace brick. I could have destroyed it, could have erased all the proof, all the weight of what she did. But I didn't, because the truth doesn't lose its power in silence. Sometimes it sharpens. Sometimes just knowing is enough. I left it there not as a threat, but as a relic, a quiet boundary between past and future. If ever someone came again with greed, disguised as affection with a plan masked in charm, the house would already be armed. Late July brought thunder. Not storms, just the kind of distant rumbles that remind you nature is always watching. I loved those nights. I'd sit by the window with a cup of tea and let the sounds roll through me. It felt like a lullaby sung by the earth itself, old and slow and sure of itself. Sometimes I read Dad's letters aloud to the house, not dramatically, just conversationally. A memory here, a question there. Once I asked the air, did you know you'd be teaching me more after you were gone than you ever did while alive? The creak in the ceiling above me made it sound like he laughed. I began writing essays, long form letters, really about inheritance, but not in the legal sense, in the emotional sense. The way we inherit silence, strength, the way we carry our dead without burying what they gave us. I didn't write them to publish. I wrote them to understand. One afternoon, I found an old Polaroid tucked inside a gardening book, me age 5, covered in dirt holding up a dandelion like it was treasure. Dad had scribbled on the back, "She already knows how to bloom in unlikely places." That's what this house had done, what I had done. Rebuilt in the shadow of betrayal, grown roots in soil once threatened, bloomed in the space left behind by absence. I began to speak of Dad less in past tense. Not because I denied his death, but because death had never really taken him. It had taken his body, his voice, but not the way he moved through things, not the fingerprints in the grain of the stairs, not the steadiness he'd built into me. One evening near the end of summer, I invited a few friends over. Nothing big, just dinner wine conversation under the stars. I set the table in the garden, strung up soft lights along the rose trellis, lit candles with the scent of bergamot and cedar, his favorites. As we sat there laughing over stories, sipping slowly, I looked up and realized this is what she never understood. This is what she tried to erase. You can own a structure, you can sign papers, sell walls, but you can't buy the way people belong to a place. That night, after everyone left, I lingered in the garden barefoot on dewy grass and looked up at the window of the study. A single lamp was still on inside. I could see the outline of the old desk, the worn chair, the shelves lined with books that held generations of voices. And then, like a ritual I hadn't known I'd needed, I whispered into the night. It's safe now. Not for him, for me. I went inside, closed the doors, and slept better than I had in years. By the first signs of autumn, the fig tree had grown 3 new leaves. I watched it every morning, like a mother watches her child sleep. Not out of fear, but wonder. I'd begun to understand what it meant to be a guardian, not just of objects or land, but of meaning. One morning, I found an envelope in the mailbox. No handwriting this time, just typed sterile legal. It was the final confirmation. The county had transferred full uncontested title of the house to my name in perpetuity, with records sealed under trust. No challenges, no loopholes. It was over, truly. I framed the letter not out of pride, but as punctuation. The quiet period at the end of a long, twisted sentence. I hung it beside the front door beneath a new plaque I had made from salvaged wood. It read, "This house remembers, because it did. It remembered pain, it remembered laughter, it remembered being nearly lost and saved." In October, I began restoring the attic. It had long been a place of storage, shadows, and things half forgotten, but I wanted something else now, a writing room. A place not just to remember, but to create. It took weeks. I sanded the floor myself, painted the beams, installed a desk beneath the dormer window where the morning light arrived like ceremony. On the wall above that desk, I hung the photo of Dad kneeling in the garden, hand buried in rose soil, smiling like he'd tricked the whole world by loving something so simple. Underneath it, a single line carved into wood. Legacy is how we tend what others try to destroy. Winter didn't arrive with snow that year, just silence. Not the kind that makes you brace for something worse, but the kind that feels earned like a sigh after a long journey. The world outside dimmed early, the garden curled inward, and the house began to hum differently. I could hear it in the radiators and the floorboards warming beneath wool socks in the kettle that now sang only for me. The attic was finished. It was mine now, not just the space, but what it represented. For years, I'd walked through this house like I was borrowing time, as if she might return, as if something might be undone. But now this was a home, rebuilt by memory and willpower, by the patience he planted in me, by the silence I learned to trust. I wrote every day, not because anyone asked me to, not for a deadline or a publisher or some grand reason, but because the words had always been there, hiding behind the fear beneath the layers of politeness waiting. For years, I'd only spoken when necessary. With Rebecca, that was survival. But now, without her noise, I was starting to hear what I'd silenced in myself. Some days I wrote about the house, its quirks, its size, the history tucked in between baseboards and beams. Other days I wrote about my father, the way he taught me to hold a screwdriver like a scalpel, or how he hummed the same jazz riff every time he cooked eggs. But most often I wrote about the in-between, the places where grief and gratitude blur, the slow transformation of pain into purpose, the invisible inheritance, the kind you carry in your blood. I never needed to publish them. That was never the point. The act of writing was itself a preservation of him, of me, of the house that held us both like a secret too precious to speak aloud. One afternoon in January, I received a letter. No return address, just a simple off-white envelope with my name printed in a delicate serif. Inside was a small check, not large, but enough to notice, and a note. For what I took, not enough to balance it, but maybe enough to begin again. It wasn't signed. It didn't have to be. Rebecca. I didn't cash it. Not because I was angry, but because the money wasn't mine. And forgiveness isn't a transaction. I placed it in a drawer alongside her last letter behind a paperweight made from garden stone. I wanted it to stay there out of sight, but not out of mind, a strange artifact from a life that nearly collapsed under its own selfishness. She was gone, but she had tried in some fractured, late blooming way to acknowledge what she'd done. And maybe that's all some people are capable of. We don't always get justice in the form we expect. Sometimes we get silence, and sometimes silence is justice. By spring, the house had taken on a new rhythm. It no longer held its breath. Friends visited more often, not out of pity, but comfort. They said it felt easy to be here now, like the air had softened. Even strangers seemed to linger longer on the sidewalk, glancing toward the garden, smiling at the stained glass windows when sunlight hit just right. I began giving away rose clippings. At first, just a neighbor or two, a widow who'd lost her husband last year, a young couple with a bare yard and a child on the way. I showed them how to root the stems, how to prune gently, how to speak to the plants like they were listening. Because they are. Everything listens when you tend it with intention. I found joy in this passing forward what he'd passed to me. Not just roses, but roots. On what would have been Dad's 75th birthday, I stood alone in the garden before dawn. The sky was still ink dark, the stars reluctant to fade. I held a single rose in my hand, not a red one, but the dusty mauve he once called the brave color. He said it reminded him of quiet people who speak only when it matters. I placed it on the soil beneath the fig tree. The tree had grown well 4 feet tall now, twisting toward the morning like it had been here longer than one season. Its branches shook slightly in the breeze, and I could have sworn they bowed. I spoke out loud, not dramatically, just clearly. I didn't fight her dad. I waited. I listened. I learned. And when the time was right, I stood where you once stood. And the house stood with me. There was no answer, no sign, just the wind through the leaves, soft and affirming. And it was enough. The following summer, I was asked to speak at a local history gathering, a small event celebrating restored homes in our county. The organizer had heard about the house, the Trust the Garden. She asked if I'd be willing to share a few words about legacy. I hesitated for days because the story wasn't clean. And legacy, real legacy, doesn't come in tidy chapters. But I said yes. On the day of the event, I stood beneath a tent in a field not far from our property. Around 20 people sat on folding chairs. A few dogs wandered lazily through the grass. It wasn't grand. It was perfect. I spoke for 10 minutes. About memory, about quiet strength, about a man who didn't fight fire with fire, but with paperwork foresight and a belief that his daughter would know what to do when the time came. I didn't name her. She didn't deserve a place in the story. What I said in closing was this: some homes are built with wood and nails, others with love and letters. Mine was built with both. And when someone tried to sell it out from under me, they forgot one thing. You can't sell what doesn't belong to you, and you can't erase a legacy if someone is still living it. The applause was gentle, honest. Afterward, a woman in her 60s approached me. She'd lost her brother to a bitter inheritance fight. He never got the house, never got the closure. But you did, she said. I nodded, because he planned it that way. She smiled. He must have been a remarkable man. He was, I said, but more than that, he believed in the long game. I still live in the house today. The fig tree now shades half the garden bench. The roses wrap the fence like they're guarding the space with velvet swords. The study is still his and mine, and neither a shared memory that smells like cedar and paper and time. I've added my own touches. A few new shelves, a record player that doesn't skip, a small silver plaque by the front door etched in quiet letters. Built by hands guarded by heart. Sometimes I still think about Rebecca, not with hatred, but with distance. Like a storm you watch from a window. Fear sure, but passing. She taught me something, even if she didn't mean to, that the people who try to take the most often leave with the least, and the ones who protect quietly, steadily, with care, they endure. On the last page of the final notebook I filled that winter, I wrote a single line: no flourish, no ending punctuation. He gave me a house, I became its keeper. And now I understand. He didn't choose me because I was his daughter. He chose me because I would never confuse ownership with worth, because I would wait, because I would listen, because I would build again. And I did. The house stands, the garden blooms, the story lives, and somewhere I know he's smiling. Not because I fought, but because I never had to raise my voice, only my roots.